Chapter 6. Frank leapt into the convertible and headed for the Morton farm. He began piecing together the details of Aunt Gertrude's story about the fair-haired man at Gresham. He had said Hardy. I'm sure he didn't mean Aunt Gertrude. He could have meant Dad or Joe. Then the man had made a reference to caves. There were many to be found in the cliffs where they were forming on the north shore of Barmouth Bay. Was Joe being held in one of them? Frank smiled, recalling his aunt's indignation at being called an old whaler by the big fair-haired man. He might not have been referring to whales at all, Frank thought. There's a small flat-hulled motorboat known as a motor whaler. Maybe that's what he had in mind. Frank told himself that using such a term would be unusual for any person unless he was familiar with boats. The young sleuth was certain that he had a real lead at last. As Frank drew up before the Morton house, Chet came down the steps at a run. "What's up?" he said eagerly. Frank repeated Aunt Gertrude's story of the man mentioning the name Hardy and making the mysterious reference to whalers and caves. Chet whistled. Then suddenly his eyes widened. "You mean Joe might be a prisoner in a shore cave?" "Exactly," Frank answered. "And I'll search every one of them if I have to." "Well, I'm with you. Well, how about the other fellas? Let's go get Biff and Jerry to come along. They'll be mad as hornets if they're not in on this search." "All right," Frank replied. "We'll use the sleuth." This was the Hardys' sleek motorboat. "Well, let's go," Chet said briskly. Then the ever-persistent problem of food occurred to him. "If you'll just wait a few minutes, I'll ask Mum if she can fix us up a lunch. We may be hungry, at least you may, but I'm sure I will be." Both boys dashed into the house. While Miss Morton was making up a package of sandwiches and cake, Frank reached Jerry and Biff by the telephone and gave them an inkling of what was to be afoot. They were eager to help, and promised to be at the Hardys' boathouse within 20 minutes. In a short time, Chet was ready, and scrambling into the convertible beside Frank. At the boathouse, Jerry and Biff were waiting for them. Biff was a tall, lanky blonde, whose perpetual good humor was indicated by the slight tilt on the outer corner of his lips. Jerry, medium height and dark, was wiry and more serious. Both boys were agog with curiosity. "What's the clue?" Jerry asked, and Frank gave the details as he unlocked the door of the boathouse. The boys quickly unmoored the sleuth and jumped aboard. The engine sputtered sporadically a few times and then burst into a roar. Frank opened the throttle, and the craft shot into the bay, gradually increasing speed. "If we don't find Joe, then what?" Jerry asked. Frank called back, "Oh, we'll go down the coast tomorrow. There's a few caves along that beach. You fellas game?" "You all bet," they chorused. There were clouds in the sky, and far off towards the open water at the distant end of the bay was a hint of fog. Frank eyed the mist doubtfully. It would take some time to make a close search of the caves on the north shore, and if fog came up, a hunt would become difficult. Chet, thinking the same thing, mentioned it aloud. "We'll just have to hope for the best," Biff spoke up. As they zipped along, the boys talked over Miss Hardy's encounter with the fair-haired man. "He may be tall," said Biff, "but he sure sounds like he's short on brains." "He'll need all the brains he has if we get on his trail," Chet affirmed. "But why would he be mixed up in Joe's disappearance?" said Biff. "Surely he wouldn't kidnap Joe just because Chet stepped on him." "There's got to be something deeper behind it," Frank said, thinking of the secret radio. "But I'm not at liberty to tell you fellas." The sleuth sped towards the north shore and gradually drew closer to the high cliffs that rose sheer from the waters of the bay. The fog was coming up the bay now in a high, menacing gray wall. Chet grimaced. "We're not going to make it." That fog will be on us before we get within a quarter mile of them caves." "I'm afraid so," Frank said. "But I hate to give up now that we've come this far." "I got a few experiences in fog out on this bay," Biff Hopper remarked, "and I don't want to repeat 'em if it can be helped. You never know when some other boat's going to come along and run you down. You can't see it until that boat's right on top of you. Let one of those big ships wallop in you and you're done for." "And a horn ain't much good neither," said Jerry, "because the fog seems to make the sound come from a different direction than the true one." The fog swirled down upon the boys, hiding the shore from view. It enveloped them so completely they could scarcely see more than a few yards ahead. Frank had already turned on his yellow fog light, and suddenly they saw a little tug a short distance up the bay. The craft was heading towards city, but now it vanished. Frank reduced speed and pressed the horn. There was no sound. "This is bad," said Jerry. "If it weren't for Joe, I'd say we best go home. I wonder how long this pea soup's going to last." No one ventured to guess. Frank said tensely, "Watch out for that tug, fellas. My horn doesn't seem to be working." As the sleuth groped blindly through the clammy mist, Frank thought he heard the faint throb of the tug's engines. His light did not pick up the craft, and it was impossible to estimate its distance or direction. Then came the blast of the tug's whistle, low and mournful through the heavy fog. It seemed to be far to the right, and Frank hoped to avoid it by going straight ahead. And then the whistle sounded again. It was louder, and seemed to come from a point just to their left. It was getting closer. "That old tug must be traveling about 2 miles clean across the bay in about half a minute," Chet remarked. "Frank, look out!" As he spoke, the whistle sounded again. This time Biff straightened up in alarm. The tug seemed to be directly ahead. "How do you figure its position, Frank?" "I think that tug is pretty close. It's hard to tell where that sound's coming from. We'll just have to go easy and hope we can see it first." Biff could hardly make out the stern of the sleuth. "This is worse than a blackout," he commented. Once more the whistle blew. This time, so terrifyingly loud that the tug seemed to be only a few yards away. The boys could now hear its engines, and still their light revealed nothing. "Get up in front, Chet," snapped Frank. "If you see it, sing out." Chet scrambled onto the bow and peered into the gray gloom ahead. Suddenly he gave a yell of terror. "It's bearing right down on us!" Even as he shouted, a heavy dark shadow loomed out of the fog, and the sleuth was about to be rammed. The tug was sweeping down on the boys. He was only a few yards away. The boys could see a man on deck, waving his arm wildly, and the whistle shrieking. No time to lose. The engine of the sleuth broke into a sudden clamor as Frank opened the throttle wide. At the same instant, he swung the wheel hard to port. The motorboat swerved and shot directly across the bow of the larger boat, and for a breathless second it seemed like nothing could save the boys. They waited for the jarring impact that seemed only seconds away. But the sleuth had speed, and Frank handled his craft masterfully, and his boat shot clear. The tug went roaring astern. It had missed the sleuth by less than a yard to spare. The Hardy's boat was caught in the heavy swell and pitched to and fro, but rode it out. Chet broke the silence. "Whew, that was a close call." Jerry Gilroy, who had been thrown off balance when the sleuth altered its course so suddenly, scrambled to his feet, blinking. "Say, were we hit?" "We're still here," Biff grinned. Nevertheless, he'd been badly frightened. "That's the last time I'll ever come out on this bay when there's a fog a-brewing. That was too narrow of a squeak." Chet, now that the peril had passed, leaned down from the bow. He shook hands with the other 3 boys, and then gravely clasped his own. "What's that for?" Jerry asked. "Congratulating you and myself for coming out alive." The others smiled weakly. Frank steered the sleuth back to its previous course. Again, the boat crept towards the north shore, invisible beyond the wall of mist. Frank did not dare to venture close for fear of piling his craft into the rocks at the foot of the cliffs. He cruised aimlessly back and forth, but within half an hour the fog began to lift. It thinned out, writhing and twisting like plumes of smoke. "The cliffs!" Chet cried in relief as the boys caught sight of the land rising sharply just ahead. They were less than 200 yards offshore and already far down the bay, abreast of the caves. "Well, we can make our search after all," Frank said. He brought the sleuth as near the base of the cliffs as he dared, skillfully avoiding the menacing black rocks that thrust above the water. Jerry, who had scrambled out on the bow, gestured towards the upcracking rocks about 100 yards away. "That's the first cliff," he announced. "I remember," said Frank. "Joe and I, we went into that one when we were on a car thief case. It looks like a cave, but it's only a few feet deep. There's no use looking in there." The searchers passed several shallow openings, but at last Chet gave a jubilant shout. "Here's some deeper ones." They were rounding a little promontory that the boys saw a ragged row of gaping holes in the face of the rocks. Most were just a few feet above the water line. Chet said, "I know them. Some are small, but some are big enough for an elephant to walk through sideways." Frank brought the sleuth in close to the base of the 200-foot-high cliffs. "A great place to hide someone," Biff commented. "I bet there's hundreds of those caverns." "Well, we'll sure have our work cut out for us," Frank agreed. Some distance on, he spotted the first of the larger holes in the rocks. The cave was 6 foot wide and high above the water. Frank ran the boat in close enough so that by scrambling over its bow one could land upon the tumbling rocks and boulders just beneath the opening. "Let's take a look," he said eagerly. "Jerry, can you hold the boat here?" "Sure, go ahead." Within a few minutes the others were climbing up the boulders towards the cave mouth, and then presently they vanished into the dark interior. End of chapter 6.